In New Mexico, the year of our Lord, 1886, the dust had a memory. It settled in the creases of a man's smile and the hem of a woman's dress, a fine red powder that testified to every secret and sorrow. The town of Dry Creek was built on this remembering dust, a place where water was a currency more precious than gold, and gossip was the cheapest thing a soul could trade. The wind that scoured the cracked earth and worried the life out of the brittle bush whispered a constant warning. Nothing stays buried for long in Dry Creek. Eleanor Vance knew the taste of that dust. At 28, she had swallowed enough of it to last a lifetime. Once, her voice had filled the Silver Spur Saloon, a thread of melody that could quiet a room of rowdy cattlemen. Now, her hands worked a needle and thread in the dim light of Mrs. Albright's fine tailoring, her songs replaced by the steady snip of shears. She was an orphan, a woman of few words, marked by a faint, silvered scar that traced a delicate line along her throat, a permanent whisper from a fire that had claimed her past. Her oldest friend, the only person who knew the story of the scar, was May Turner. They had grown up together, two scrawny girls sharing whorehound candy and impossible dreams of escaping the red dust, of seeing an ocean or a city where the buildings touched the sky. But dreams had a way of drying up in the desert heat. May had found her escape not in a train ticket, but in the arms of the town's most ambitious man. She was Mrs. Mayor Turner now, her dresses made of silk shipped all the way from St. Louis, her hands soft and uncalloused. The law in Dry Creek was a man as quiet and unyielding as the landscape itself. Sheriff Elias Boone was 35, a widower whose grief had settled into his bones, leaving him with a principled stillness that most folks mistook for coldness. They said his gaze was as steady as a rock in a sandstorm, and it was a gaze that missed very little. He saw the desperation behind a gambler's bluff and the truth in a child's tears. He ran his town with a quiet authority that required no shouting. The trouble started on a Tuesday, when the sun was at its most punishing. May Turner, her face a perfect mask of distress, came running from the small adobe church, her gloved hands fluttering at her throat. The church fund, a collection of dollars and cents meant for a new roof before the summer rains, was gone. It had been kept in a small lockbox, and May, in her role as the mayor's wife and a pillar of the community, had just discovered the theft. Sheriff Boone arrived as the crowd was gathering, a flock of crows drawn to a carcass. He listened, his expression unchanging, as May recounted her story. She had gone to add a contribution from the mayor, only to find the box empty. Her voice broke as she delivered the final, damning detail. She had seen Eleanor Vance leaving the church not an hour before, looking flustered. The betrayal was a clean, sharp thing, like a knife slipping between the ribs. It was May who pointed the finger. May, who knew Eleanor was saving every spare penny to buy a small plot of land of her own. May, who knew the whole town's prejudice was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. And May, whose husband, Mayor Turner, had been making expensive trips to Santa Fe and gambling away town assets, a fact whispered only in the darkest corners of the saloon. The town turned on Eleanor with the swift, unthinking cruelty of a mob. It was easy to believe the worst of a woman who had once sung for her supper in a saloon, a woman who carried a scar and kept to herself. She was cursed, they murmured. First the fire, now this Mrs. Albright dismissed her that very afternoon, her face pinched with disapproval. The grocer, Mr. Henderson, suddenly found he was out of the flour she tried to buy. Doors that had once been open to her were now closed and bolted. She walked through the town she had known her whole life and felt like a ghost, the whispers following her like the dry rustle of snakes in the grass. As the sun began to bleed across the western horizon, the sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow. A stillness fell over Dry Creek, the kind of heavy silence that comes before a storm. The wind began to pick up, not with its usual lazy sigh, but with a low, mournful howl. It was the first big sandstorm of the season, and it came like a judgment, whipping the red dust into a frenzy, blurring the lines between the buildings, erasing the world. The storm was a physical manifestation of the town's own blindness, a swirling chaos of accusation and fear. Sheriff Ellis Boone walked through the growing gale, his hat pulled low, the collar of his coat turned up against the stinging sand. He found Eleanor in her small, rented room behind the tailor shop. She was sitting on her narrow bed, her hands folded in her lap, watching the storm rage outside her single window. She was not crying. He stood in the doorway, the wind tearing at the frame, his duty a heavy weight in his gut. Every instinct he had, honed by years of reading men, told him this was wrong. The story was too neat, May Turner's tears too theatrical. He had seen the way Mayor Turner's eyes darted about when asked a direct question. But the town wanted a villain, a sacrifice to appease their fear of uncertainty. Justice was a slow, methodical thing, but public opinion was a flash flood. He had to make an arrest. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice even against the roar of the wind, "I need you to come with me." She looked at him then, and her gaze was as steady as his own. There was no fear in her eyes, only a deep, profound weariness. She did not argue or protest. She simply stood, pulled a thin shawl around her shoulders, and walked toward him. The journey to the town's small jail was a battle against the elements. The wind screamed, and the sand scoured their skin. Visibility reduced to mere feet. Elias held her arm, not just to restrain her, but to keep her anchored against the storm's fury. The world had been reduced to the two of them, a circle of swirling chaos lit by the occasional, spectral flicker of lightning. They were halfway across the main street when a brilliant fork of white light split the sky, illuminating the world in a stark, momentary clarity. In that instant, Elias saw her face perfectly. The wind had whipped strands of dark hair across her cheeks, and the red dust clung to her skin like paint. But her expression was one of absolute, unshakable resolve. There were no tears, no pleas for mercy, just a quiet dignity that defied the storm both outside and within the town. In that flash of lightning, a simple truth struck him with the force of a physical blow. This woman is not guilty. She is just damned by the wrong people. The storm passed as all things did in the desert, leaving the air washed clean and cold and the sky a startling, bruised blue. In the small stone jail, the silence was absolute. Eleanor Vance sat on the edge of the hard cot, her hands lying still in her lap. The single barred window looked out onto an alleyway, offering a sliver of the immense, indifferent sky. She had not wept. She had not paced the narrow confines of her cell. She had simply sat, a study in stillness, as the town of Dry Creek prepared to devour her. When Sheriff Elias Boone brought her a tin plate of beans and stale bread, he expected to be met with a torrent of denials, with the desperate, angry tears of the unjustly accused. He found none of it. She took the plate with a quiet nod of thanks. He lingered by the cell door, a large, solid presence in the gloom. She looked at him then, her eyes clear and direct in the dim light. Her voice was low and steady when she spoke, carrying a question that landed with the weight of a stone. She asked if the town still sang hymns for sinners, or if they only sang for themselves now. The question hung in the air between them, sharp and clean as a shard of glass. It was not a plea for his belief, but a simple, devastating observation. Elias had no answer for her. He saw in that moment the vast, silent pain she carried, the quiet dignity that refused to be broken by the howling mob. He felt the shame of his town, of the badge he wore, and knew he was complicit in a lie. He turned and left without a word, the sound of his boots echoing on the stone floor. The poison of rumor spread faster than prairie fire. In the saloon, over hands of poker, men embellished the story. She was not just a thief, they said, but a woman of loose morals from her time at the Silver Spur, a place no decent woman would ever set foot. By the time the story reached the women gathered around the well, Eleanor had become something more sinister. Mrs. Henderson swore she had seen Eleanor muttering strange words over the well late one night. Surely a sign she meant to poison their water. By week's end, the whispers had coalesced into a monstrous certainty. The fire that had burned down the old saloon years ago, the one that had scarred her throat, had been her doing. She was a harbinger of disaster, a curse upon the town. In her cell, Eleanor felt the weight of this collective hatred. It seeped through the stone walls, a cold and suffocating presence. She was utterly alone. No one came to visit. No friends from the church. No former patrons of the tailor shop. The town that had known her since she was a girl had erased her, had rewritten her life into a cautionary tale. Her only human contact was with the sheriff and old Henry, the jailer. Henry was a man stooped with age, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes a faded blue. He did not believe in gossip, only in what he saw. He saw a young woman bearing an impossible burden with a quiet grace. He would bring her an extra blanket when the nights turned cold and sometimes a piece of jerky from his own pocket. Small kindnesses that felt as precious as rain in that dry, hateful place. The long hours in the cell gave her nothing to do but remember. She would close her eyes and the smell of lye and dust would fade, replaced by the scent of spilled whiskey, sawdust, and cheap perfume. She was back in the Silver Spur, standing on the small Rick Weiss stage. The oil lamps cast a warm, amber glow, catching the smoke that drifted in lazy blue ribbons toward the ceiling. She would wait for the noise to die down, for the clink of glasses and the gruff laughter to fade into a respectful hush. And then she would sing. Her voice was not powerful, but it was clear and true, filled with a sweet melancholy that spoke of loss and longing. For those few moments, she could hold an entire room of rough wool, lonely men in the palm of her hand. They saw not a saloon girl, but a woman who understood the language of their own unarticulated sorrows. Then came the memory of the fire. It always started the same way, with the smell of smoke, sharp and acrid, the chaos, the shouting, the stampede for the doors. She remembered the heat, a living thing that clawed at her skin, and the suffocating blackness that filled her lungs. A falling beam, a flash of searing pain at her throat, and then nothing. The fire had taken everything. Her job, her home, her voice for a time. It had left her with a scar and a deep, abiding fear of flames. She saw it now not just as a tragedy, but as a test, a burning away of everything that was not essential. This, too, was a fire, this trial by rumor and suspicion. It was a different kind of flame, one that burned not with heat but with the cold fury of injustice. And she did not know if she had the strength to survive it a second time. Elias Boone could not let it rest. The woman's question echoed in his mind, a constant reproach. He worked late into the nights, the lantern on his desk the only light in the sleeping town. He started with the church's ledgers, then the town's financial records. It was a tangled mess of numbers. But one name appeared again and again, Mayor Turner. There were payments for services never rendered, for supplies never delivered. Following a hunch, he went to the bank in the next town over, where he knew Turner kept a private account. He used the authority of his office, his steady gaze quelling the protests of the nervous bank clerk. And there it was, a transfer receipt, a large sum of money, withdrawn from the Dry Creek Church Fund and deposited directly into the personal account of Mayor Augustus Turner. The evidence was as plain and ugly as a rattlesnake coiled on a doorstep. He secured Eleanor's release the next day. The circuit judge was a timid man, easily swayed by public opinion and the mayor's influence. But he could not argue with the sheriff's cold logic, or the fact that Elias Boone was willing to post the bond himself, a public declaration of his own faith in her innocence. The news of her release sent a ripple of outrage through the town. That evening, Eleanor walked out of the jail, a free woman in name only. Elias walked beside her, his presence a silent shield against the town's animosity. The sun was setting, painting the street in long, distorted shadows. People stopped to stare as they passed. Women gathered their skirts and hurried their children inside. Men standing outside the saloon fell silent, their eyes following her with a mixture of contempt and suspicion. No one spoke to her. No one met her gaze. Dry Creek forgot her the way it forgets the rain, a temporary inconvenience already dismissed from memory. They reached the sheriff's office, its wooden facade a small bastion of order in the dusty street. She stopped on the boardwalk, uncertain. She had nowhere to go, no home, no job, no place in this town that had so thoroughly cast her out. Elias unlocked the door and held it open. He told her there was work, if she wanted it. His official tone was a thin cover for his true intent. He explained that he needed help keeping the records, sweeping the floors, making coffee. The county was short on funds for a proper deputy. He said it was honest work, and he would pay a fair wage. Eleanor looked from his face to the dark, quiet space of the office. It was not charity he was offering, but a lifeline. In his steady gaze, she saw not pity, but respect. For the first time since May Turner had spoken her name in the church, a flicker of something other than despair stirred within her. She stepped across the threshold, out of the dying light and into the shelter he had offered. The sheriff's office became her sanctuary. It was a small, spare space, smelling of old paper, gun oil, and the faint, ever-present scent of the red dust that filtered through the cracks in the walls. Her days fell into a quiet rhythm, a stark contrast to the chaos of her recent past. She swept the wooden floors until they shone, her broom moving with a steady, determined whisk that seemed to push back against the tide of the town's ill will. She organized the stacks of wanted posters and legal notices, her neat handwriting bringing order to the violent and messy business of the law. She brewed coffee on the small pot-bellied stove, a dark, bitter brew that was more about warmth and wakefulness than pleasure. These were small, simple tasks, the kind of work a woman might do anywhere. But for Eleanor, they were imbued with a profound significance. Her hands knew honest work. After the gaudy artifice of the saloon and the suffocating judgment of the tailor shop, the straightforward reality of her duties in the sheriff's office was a balm to her spirit. Here, her worth was not measured by the quality of her voice or the straightness of her seams, but by the clean floor and the legible ledger. It was the first time in a long while that her work had felt meaningful. One afternoon, Elias Boone placed a heavy Colt revolver on the desk in front of her. The blued steel was dark and menacing against the worn wood. He told her it was time she'd learned how to use it. He did not want her to learn how to kill. He explained, his voice low and serious. He wanted her to learn how to keep fear at a distance. The world was a hard place, and a woman alone needed to be able to stand her ground. He took her out to a dry wash behind the town, where the only audience was the buzzards circling high in the pale sky. He showed her how to stand, how to hold the weapon with both hands to steady its kick, how to line up the sights on a row of tin cans he had placed on a rock. His instructions were patient and precise. His hands would briefly touch her arms to adjust her stance. His proximity, a solid, reassuring presence. The first time she pulled the trigger, the sound was a deafening crack that echoed off the canyon walls, and the force of the recoil sent a shock through her arms. But she did not flinch. She fired again, and again, until the cans were dancing on the rock. A quiet sense of power settled in her, a feeling she had not known she was capable of. It was not the power to harm, but the power to say no, to draw a line in the sand that no one could cross. Their lives became intertwined in the small, quiet moments that filled the spaces between crises. Sometimes, when the moon was high and the town was sunk in a nervous sleep, he would ask her to ride with him on his night patrols. They would saddle their horses and move like shadows through the sleeping streets and out into the vast, silent expanse of the desert. The landscape that was so harsh and unforgiving by day transformed under the starlight. Its sharp edges softened into a silvered dreamscape. They would ride for hours, often without speaking, sharing the immense, cathedral-like silence of the night. they would stop to rest, sharing lukewarm coffee from a canteen that tasted of metal and smoke. It was during these rides that they began to exchange pieces of their pasts, small, carefully offered fragments of their lives. He told her about his late wife, Sarah, about her easy laugh and the way she had loved the desert wildflowers. He spoke of his own quiet grief, a wound that had never fully healed. She, in turn, told him about the orphanage, about the fire, about the brief, shining moments on the stage at the Silver Spur when she had felt truly seen. They were two lonely souls, adrift in a sea of dust and prejudice, finding a small, safe harbor in each other's company. One evening, a fight erupted in the saloon. Two drunken drovers, arguing over a hand of cards, had pulled knives. Elias had waded into the fray, his voice like the crack of a whip, and restored order, but not before one of the men had lunged at him. He had disarmed the man, but the knife had sliced a shallow, bloody gash along his forearm. He came back to the office, his shirt sleeve soaked in red, his face set in a grim line. Eleanor saw the blood, and her breath caught in her throat. She immediately went for the medical kit, her hands moving with a swift, practiced efficiency she had not known she possessed. She had him sit, and under the warm, steady glow of the oil lamp, she cleaned the wound. Her hands trembled slightly as she worked, the pads of her fingers brushing against the warm, taut skin of his arm. The air in the small room grew thick and still, charged with an unspoken intimacy. She could feel the steady beat of his pulse beneath her touch, smell the faint scent of soap and leather that clung to him. She wrapped the wound with a clean linen bandage, her movements gentle and focused. Elias sat perfectly still, watching her. Her head was bent in concentration, the lamplight catching the dark sheen of her hair. He felt the light pressure of her touch, and a strange, unfamiliar sensation spread through him. It had been years since someone had touched him without wanting something, without a motive or an agenda. Sarah's touch had been one of love, but since her passing, any physical contact had been either violent or transactional. This was different. This was an act of pure, simple care, and it reached a place in him that had been dormant for a very long time. Later that night, the scent of baking filled the small office. Eleanor had found a sack of cornmeal and had made a pan of cornbread on the stove. She set a piece on a plate and placed it in front of him. He ate it in silence, the warm, crumbly bread, a comforting presence in his belly. When he was finished, he looked up at her, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. She smiled back, a hesitant, fragile thing, but a smile nonetheless. In that shared moment, something shifted between them, a silent acknowledgement that they were no longer just a sheriff and his clerk, but something more. The town, of course, noticed. The whispers began anew, this time with a salacious, knowing edge. The sheriff had not just saved a thief from the gallows. They said he had taken her into his home, into his life. He had fallen for her. The story was told with winks and nudges, a fresh scandal to liven up the dull routine of their lives. When confronted by Mrs. Henderson at the general store, her face a mask of pious concern, Elias did not deny the rumor. He simply looked at her with his steady, unnerving gaze and said that maybe he just saw what others would not. The words were a quiet declaration of war against the town's blind judgment, a line drawn not in the sand, but in the bedrock of his own conviction. When the story of his defense reached Eleanor, it was like a spring thaw after a long, hard winter. A warmth spread through her chest, a feeling of being championed, of being seen for who she truly was. That afternoon, as she was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the office, she laughed. It was a real laugh, a sound of genuine amusement at something a passing child had said. The sound was so unexpected, so rare, that Elias, who was standing in the doorway, felt it like a physical blow. Her face, which he had only known as a mask of sorrow and quiet resolve, was transformed, lit from within by a light he had never seen. In that moment, watching her laugh in the harsh afternoon sun, he thought the desert itself had been blessed with rain. A few days later, he told her to close the office early. They rode out of town, not on patrol, but with no destination in mind. They followed a winding trail that led them up into the low hills. As they rounded a bend, they came upon a breathtaking sight. A whole field of prickly pear cacti was in full, glorious bloom. The waxy yellow blossoms were a riot of color against the drab green of the cactus pads and the red earth, a defiant, beautiful testament to the persistence of life in the harshest of environments. They dismounted and walked among the flowers, the air sweet with their delicate fragrance. Eleanor reached out and gently touched one of the soft, fragile petals. For the first time since she had returned to Dry Creek, she felt like she belonged somewhere. She looked at Elias, his strong, quiet form silhouetted against the setting sun, and knew that this feeling of belonging was not just about the place, but about the man standing beside her. The annual Founders' Day Fair was the one day of the year Dry Creek pretended to be a place of joy and prosperity. Bunting was strung between the drab adobe buildings, and the air, usually thick with dust and quiet resentment, was now filled with the smells of roasted corn, the sounds of a traveling fiddler, and the forced, brittle laughter of the townsfolk. It was a performance of community, and Eleanor felt the falseness of it like a fever. She was there only because Elias had insisted, his quiet logic irrefutable. Hiding would only feed the rumors. She had to walk through the fire, he had said, and show them she was not burned. She saw May Turner near the newly erected gazebo in the center of the square, dressed in a fine blue dress that must have cost more than Eleanor had ever earned in a month. May was the very picture of civic virtue. She stood behind a table draped in white linen, a brightly painted sign proclaiming for the church roof fund propped beside her. She was smiling, accepting coins and folded bills from the townspeople, her every gesture one of graceful humility. The hypocrisy of it was a physical blow, stealing the air from Eleanor's lungs. To see her former friend, the architect of her ruin, soliciting money for the very funds she had been accused of stealing, was an obscenity beyond words. Something inside Eleanor, a part of her that had been silent and patient for too long, finally broke. She began to walk toward the gazebo, her steps slow and deliberate, a path clearing before her as people recognized her and fell back, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The fiddler's tune faltered and died. A hush fell over the sun-bleached square. May looked up, her smile freezing on her face as she saw Eleanor approaching. For a moment, a flicker of genuine fear crossed her features before it was quickly masked by an expression of condescending pity. She stood a little taller, a righteous woman preparing to be gracious to a sinner. Eleanor stopped a few feet from the table. The sun was a hammer overhead, beating down on the dusty ground. She looked at the woman who had once shared all her secrets, the woman whose betrayal had been so complete, so devastating. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it carried across the silent square with perfect, chilling clarity. "You betrayed me, May, not with a knife, but with your smile." The accusation hung in the hot, still air. May's face paled beneath her carefully applied powder. She forced a small, tight laugh. "My dear Eleanor," she began, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "What is there to betray? You made your choices long ago. You were forgotten by the town. Eleanor, for your own good." The words were meant to dismiss her, to cast her as a pitiable, delusional creature. But the cruelty of the statement, the casual erasure of her entire life, only served to steel Eleanor's resolve. The crowd murmured, their allegiance shifting like sand in the wind. Across the square, Elias Boone stood watching. He had been scanning the crowd, his senses on high alert as always during a public gathering. But from the moment Eleanor had started walking toward the gazebo, his entire world had narrowed to her. He saw the strength in her posture, the righteous fire in her eyes. He saw a woman claiming her own truth in the face of a town that had tried to silence her. And in that moment, as she stood alone against the world, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that his life was irrevocably bound to hers. She found her forever in the sheriff's steady gaze. The confrontation escalated. Eleanor took a step closer. "You speak of my good," she said, her voice dropping lower. "But what of your husband's? What of the money he took? The money that was supposed to be kept in the back of the lockbox, behind the false bottom." May gasped. The color drained completely from her face. It was a fatal mistake, a detail so specific, so secret, that only two people could have known it. The person who had put the money there, and the person who had taken it. Elias heard it. His body went rigid. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. May was not just covering for her husband, she was a willing accomplice. He started moving then, his hand instinctively going to the Colt at his hip, his eyes scanning the crowd for the source of the real threat he now knew was here. Mayor Turner had been watching from the shade of the saloon's boardwalk. He saw his wife's composure shatter, saw the sheriff begin to move. A look of pure, cold panic crossed his face. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture, a flick of his fingers to a tall, gaunt man who had been loitering near the horse trough. The man's face was impassive, his eyes like chips of stone. He had been hired for this exact possibility. He drew a pistol from beneath his coat with a practiced, fluid motion. The crowd saw the gun, and a collective scream went up. But it was too late. The hired gun had his target. He aimed directly at Eleanor. Elias saw the glint of steel. The dark, round eye of the barrel pointed at the woman he loved. There was no time to think, no time for anything but action. He lunged forward, shoving people out of his way, his body a projectile aimed at a single point in space. He reached her just as the gun fired. The explosion a deafening crack that momentarily silenced the screams. He threw his body in front of hers, a human shield. A searing, white-hot pain tore through his left shoulder. The force of the impact spun him around, and he stumbled, grabbing onto Eleanor to keep from falling. The world tilted on its axis, the sounds of the fair dissolving into a dull, distant roar. Chaos erupted. People ran in every direction, their festive mood shattered by the sudden, brutal violence. In the confusion, the gunman vanished back into the panicked mob. May Turner, her face a mask of horror, turned and fled, her white table and the church's money forgotten. Elias sagged against Eleanor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He clutched her tight, his one good arm wrapped around her waist, shielding her from a threat that had already passed. He could feel the wet warmth of his own blood soaking through his shirt and onto the front of her simple cotton dress. He looked down at her, his vision starting to blur at the edges. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of terror and a fierce, protective concern. The noise, the pain, the chaos, it all faded away. There was only her face, her scent, the feeling of her body pressed against his, fear and love, hope and despair. It was all there, a tangled, inseparable knot in the center of his chest. He managed a grim, painful smile. "Guess I found my reason to live," he rasped, his voice a raw whisper, "right here in this God-forsaken dust." And then, Eleanor Vance, the woman who had not shed a single tear during her arrest, her imprisonment, or in the face of her town's unthinking cruelty, began to cry. The tears came not from a place of sorrow or fear, but from a well of emotion so deep she had thought it had long since run dry. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. She was not crying because she had almost died. She was crying because someone had been willing to die for her. She clung to him, her tears wetting his dusty shirt, her sobs the only sound that seemed real in a world that had suddenly gone mad. The bullet had torn through flesh and muscle, and Elias Boone's recovery was a slow, painful affair. The town doctor, a man with whiskey on his breath and hands that trembled, had dug the slug out and stitched him up. But it was fever and the threat of infection that became the true enemies. He lay in the narrow bed in the small room behind his office, his world reduced to the four walls, the sweat-soaked sheets, and the constant, throbbing ache in his shoulder. Through it all, Eleanor was a constant, steady presence. She moved about the small space with a quiet efficiency that was both calming and deeply intimate. She bathed his feverish skin with cool water, changed the bloody bandages, and spooned thin broth between his lips when he was too weak to feed himself. The small room, once just a place for him to sleep, became their entire world. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic, brewing herbs, and the unspoken emotions that hung between them. She would read to him from a worn copy of Shakespeare he kept on a dusty shelf, her low voice a soothing melody against the pain. In his moments of delirium, he would call out for his late wife, Sarah, and Eleanor would simply take his hand, her touch a comforting anchor in the storm of his fevered memories, and wait for the storm to pass. The town, however, did not see a woman nursing a wounded hero. They saw a viper who had coiled herself around the heart of their lawman. The narrative of the town fair shifted with the insidious speed of a desert wind. Eleanor was no longer just a thief. She was a temptress, a woman of dark arts who had bewitched the sheriff. They whispered in the general store and the saloon that she had lured him in, blinded him with her feminine wiles until he was willing to take a bullet for her. The shooting was her fault. Another piece of evidence in the growing case against her character. She had brought violence and chaos to their quiet town, turning their steady, predictable sheriff into a reckless fool. May and Mayor Turner, sensing the tide of public opinion turning in their favor, acted swiftly. They hired a lawyer from Santa Fe, a man with a silver tongue, a cold heart, and a reputation for burying his opponents in a mountain of legal paperwork and public slander. This man, Mr. Abernathy, arrived in Dry Creek like a well-dressed vulture. He immediately began to construct an alternate reality. Eleanor, he argued in petitions to the circuit judge, was an unstable and provocative woman. She had accosted the blameless Mrs. Turner at a public event, creating a public disturbance. The ensuing chaos was a direct result of her unhinged behavior. The shooting, he claimed, was a tragic but unrelated event, the act of some unknown drunkard in the panicked crowd. He filed motions to have the original theft charges reinstated and added new ones: public endangerment, incitement to violence. He was painting a picture of Eleanor not as the victim, but as the sole author of all the town's recent misfortunes. The town council, a collection of weak-willed merchants and ranchers who owed their positions to Mayor Turner, quickly fell in line, citing the clear and obvious personal relationship between the sheriff and the accused. They officially removed Elias from the investigation. It was a matter of objectivity, they declared, their faces masks of false sincerity. He was a witness, a victim himself. He could not possibly be expected to conduct an impartial investigation. The decision was a slap in the face, a public stripping of his authority and his honor. His badge felt like a useless piece of tin on his chest. He was trapped. His every instinct as a lawman screamed at him to pursue the truth, to find the gunman and expose the corruption that was eating his town alive from the inside out. But his hands were tied. To defy the council would be to abandon the very law he had sworn to uphold. Yet, to stand by and do nothing felt like a deeper betrayal. He would lie in his bed, the pain in his shoulder a dull echo of the sharp conflict in his soul. He was caught between the man he was supposed to be and the man he was becoming. Eleanor saw the toll it was taking on him. She saw the frustration in his eyes, the way his jaw would tighten when he read the latest notice from the council. She heard the whispers when she made her quick, necessary trips to the general store, the venomous words that followed her like a cloud of flies. She was the source of his trouble, the disease that was infecting his life and his reputation. The thought was a leaden weight in her stomach. She could not, would not, be the cause of his downfall. One evening, while he was sleeping, his breathing deep and even for the first time in days. She made her decision. She packed her few belongings into a small cloth satchel, a change of clothes, the small amount of money she had saved, the heavy colt he had taught her to use. She looked at him. His face relaxed in sleep, and her heart ached with a love so fierce it was almost a physical pain. To love him was to leave him. She wrote a short, simple note, leaving it on the table beside his bed, and slipped out into the cool desert night. She had made it to the edge of town, the last flickering lights of Dry Creek behind her, when she heard the sound of his footsteps. He was not wearing a boot on one foot, and his shirt was unbuttoned, his bandaged shoulder a stark white patch in the moonlight. He had read her note. He stood before her, blocking her path. His breathing labored from the exertion. He did not look angry, only deeply, profoundly weary. She would not meet his eyes, staring instead at the dusty ground between them. He said her name, his voice low and rough. He told her he had seen too much injustice in his life, too many good people broken by the powerful and the cruel. He would not stand by and watch one more good woman hang alone. The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She looked up at him then, her vision blurred with tears. She saw not a sheriff, not a lawman bound by rules, but a man who was willing to risk everything for a principle. For her, he had made his choice. He led her back to the small room, his hand warm and firm on her arm. The battle inside him was over. He would find the truth, not as a sheriff, but as a man. He began his own investigation, a secret war waged from his sickbed. He spent hours poring over the bank records he had already obtained, searching for a connection, a name, anything that might link Mayor Turner to the gunman at the fair. A few days later, the sky, which had been a merciless, cloudless blue for months, began to turn a deep, bruised gray. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance, and then the rain began to fall. It was not the violent, scouring rain of a thunderstorm, but a slow, steady, soaking rain. The first of the season, the smell of the wet dust rose from the earth, a clean, primal scent. Eleanor, feeling suffocated by the close confines of the room and the weight of all that had happened, felt an overwhelming urge to be outside. She walked out into the street, lifting her face to the sky. The cool water washed over her, plastering her hair to her head and her thin dress to her skin. It ran in rivulets down her face, mingling with her silent tears. It was as if the sky itself was weeping, washing away the blood and the lies, the hatred and the fear. She stood there for a long time, letting the water soak through to her bones, a baptism not of forgiveness for her sins, but of cleansing from the sins that had been committed against her. Elias came and stood in the doorway, watching her. He saw her there, a solitary figure in the downpour, and he did not see a victim. He saw a woman of incredible, unbreakable strength. He walked out into the rain, unmindful of the water soaking his clothes and his bandage. He came to stand in front of her, the water dripping from his hair and his chin. He reached out and gently brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. And then, in the quiet, rain-soaked street, with the whole town hidden away behind their closed doors, he kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or desperate need, but one of infinite tenderness, a silent promise that sealed the vow he had made to her in the desert moonlight. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against hers, and whispered the words that banished the last of her ghosts. "You are not alone anymore." In that moment, a love that had been growing in the silent spaces between them, in shared coffee and quiet glances, was finally given a voice. It was a dangerous, defiant love, born amidst the smoke of a gunshot and the poison of a town's prejudice. And they both knew, as the rain continued to fall around them, that it had set them on a course from which there could be no retreat. The decision to leave for Santa Fe was made in the quiet hours before dawn, with Elias's shoulders still aching and the threat of Mayor Turner's influence hanging over them like a gathering storm. Elias knew that the proof he needed, the undeniable chain of evidence that would connect Turner to the stolen money and the hired gunmen, would not be found in Dry Creek. Turner was too careful, his power too absolute. They had to go to the source, to the territorial capital where land deeds were filed and secrets were bought and sold in backroom deals. They left under the cover of darkness, riding 2 sturdy horses packed with enough jerky, hardtack, and water to last the journey. Elias still moved stiffly, his arm in a sling, but a cold, hard resolve had settled in his eyes. He was no longer acting as a sheriff. He was a man seeking justice, unburdened by the town charter but driven by a deeper law. Eleanor rode beside him, the heavy Colt revolver he had given her holstered securely at her hip. The weight of it was a constant, solid reminder of the world they were now living in, a world where safety was not guaranteed by a badge, but by a steady hand and a quick eye. The Badlands stretched before them, a vast, unforgiving expanse of cracked earth, twisted mesas and skeletal rock formations. The sun beat down, and the sky was a relentless, empty blue. They rode in silence for long stretches, the only sound the plodding of the horses' hooves and the sigh of the wind. They were 2 small figures in an immense, indifferent landscape, their quest a tiny, fragile thing against the backdrop of eternity. On the 3rd day, as they were making their way through a narrow, winding canyon, trouble found them. It came in the form of 3 men who appeared as if from the rocks themselves, their faces masked by dirty bandanas, their rifles leveled. They were road agents, the kind who preyed on solitary travelers, their eyes hard and hungry. Elias's hand went to his gun, but he knew they were at a disadvantage. He was wounded, and they were outnumbered. He reined in his horse, his voice calm and even as he told the men they could have the horses and the supplies, so long as they left him and the woman unharmed. The leader, a big man with cruel, piggy eyes, laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the canyon walls. He was not interested in just the horses. He had other ideas about what he wanted from Eleanor. A cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over her. She felt herself shrinking, the old, helpless terror of the victim threatening to paralyze her. She was back in the fire, back in the town square, a target for the whims of brutal men. But then she looked at Elias. She saw the pain in his face as he tried to subtly shift his body to shield her, the fury in his eyes as he calculated their impossible odds. He was willing to die here for her, in this dusty, forgotten canyon. And in that instant, something shifted within her. The fear did not vanish, but it was joined by something else, something fierce and powerful. It was the same protective instinct that had driven him to take a bullet for her. The men were advancing, their attention focused on Elias, whom they saw as the only real threat. The leader was still talking, savoring his power, when Eleanor's hand closed around the cool, checkered grip of the Colt. She remembered Elias's words, not to kill, but to keep fear at a distance. She drew the weapon in one smooth, practiced motion. The sound of the hammer being cocked was a loud, definitive click in the sudden silence. All 3 men turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of surprise and contemptuous amusement. But the amusement died when they saw her eyes. They were not the eyes of a frightened woman. They were cold, steady, and filled with a resolve as hard as the canyon rock. The first shot was deafening. She did not aim at the man, but at the rock just beside his head. The bullet struck with a sharp crack, sending a spray of stone fragments into his face. He howled, more in surprise than pain, and stumbled back. The other 2 men raised their rifles, but they were too late. Elias had seized the opportunity. His own pistol was in his good hand, and he fired twice in quick succession. One of the men dropped his rifle and clutched his arm, his face a mask of agony. The other, seeing the fight was lost, turned and scrambled back up the rocks. disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The leader, his face bleeding from the stone chips, followed close behind, dragging his wounded companion with him. The silence that descended was more profound than before. The air smelled of gunpowder and fear. Eleanor's hand was shaking, the heavy revolver suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She had done it. She, Eleanor Vance, the saloon singer, the seamstress, the accused thief, had faced down armed men and saved them both. The victim had become the protector. She looked at Elias, and the pride in his eyes was a greater reward than any applause she had ever received. Santa Fe was a dizzying whirlwind of noise and people after the stark silence of the desert. Carriages clattered over cobblestone streets, and the air was filled with a babble of English and Spanish. They found a modest boarding house and spent the next day at the Territorial Land Office. It took hours of patient searching through dusty, ink-stained ledgers, but they found it. A deed of sale for a large tract of land in the mineral-rich hills north of Dry Creek. The land had been purchased less than a month ago, and the buyer of record was a holding company whose registered agent was none other than Mayor Augustus Turner. The money used for the purchase matched to the dollar the amount missing from the church fund. It was the proof they needed, the cold, hard fact that would unravel Turner's web of lies. That evening, as they were walking through the city's main plaza, a familiar melody reached Eleanor's ears. It was a sad, sweet ballad she used to sing at the Silver Spur. She followed the sound to its source, a lone musician, a man named Silas, playing a battered guitar for a handful of coins. She had known him from her saloon days, a kind, gentle soul who drifted from town to town, his music his only possession. He recognized her at once, his tired eyes lighting up with genuine pleasure. They spoke for a while, reminiscing about the old days. She told him a little of her recent troubles, and as she spoke of the fire that had taken everything, a strange, sad look came over Silas's face. He told her he had been in Dry Creek the night of the fire. He had seen something he had been too afraid to speak of at the time. He had seen two men who worked for Turner, sneaking around the back of the saloon just before the smoke began to pour out, and later, he had overheard them talking, boasting about how Turner had paid them well to start the blaze. The owner of the saloon had refused to sell his property to Turner, who wanted the land for his own expansion plans. The fire had not been an accident. It had been a deliberate act of destruction, a crime committed so that Turner could collect the insurance money and buy the land for a fraction of its worth. The world seemed to fall away from Eleanor. The cheerful lights of the plaza, the sound of the music, the chatter of the crowd, it all faded into a dull, meaningless roar. It was not just the theft, not just the false accusation. Her entire life, the pivotal, tragic event that had scarred her and set her on her current path, had been orchestrated by the same man. She was not just a recent victim of his greed. She had been one for years. She felt a wave of profound, crushing despair. She was a pawn in a game she had not even known she was playing. Her life a series of misfortunes authored by one powerful, ruthless man. She stumbled away from Silas, her vision blurring, and sank onto a nearby bench, the weight of it all threatening to shatter her. Elias found her there, her head in her hands. He sat beside her, his presence a silent, solid comfort in the encroaching darkness. He did not offer empty platitudes or easy reassurances. He simply waited. When she finally looked up, her face streaked with tears, he gently took her hand. His voice was low and steady, a bedrock of certainty in her swirling sea of despair. "Justice is not fast out here," he said, "but it is worth the wait." They left Santa Fe the next morning. As they rode through the arid landscape, they passed a solitary yucca plant standing tall against the horizon. It was in full, glorious bloom, a towering spire of creamy white blossoms reaching toward the heavens. It was a startling, impossible burst of beauty in the middle of the desolation, a symbol of hope and resilience in a world that seemed determined to crush them. That night, they made camp under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. They sat by the small fire, the flames dancing and crackling, casting flickering shadows on their faces. The fire, which had for so long been a source of terror for Eleanor, now felt like a source of warmth and life. It reflected in her eyes, no longer a memory of destruction, but a promise of shared comfort. They did not speak much. Words felt inadequate for what lay between them, as the fire burned down to glowing embers. Their hands, which had been resting on the ground between them, found each other, their fingers intertwined, a silent, binding promise. Elias watched her, the soft firelight on her face, and a thought came to him, clear and true as the North Star. Maybe love is just another kind of courage. They saw Dry Creek from a low rise in the road, the familiar collection of squat adobe buildings shimmering in the afternoon heat. It did not look like a sanctuary or a home. It looked like a trap. The evidence they carried, the signed deed and the sworn testimony from Silas folded carefully in Elias's saddlebag, felt both immensely powerful and dangerously fragile. Elias pulled his horse to a stop, his eyes scanning the seemingly sleeping town. His good hand rested near the butt of his pistol. He remarked that it was too quiet. The usual midday traffic of wagons and riders was absent. The main street was empty. Eleanor felt a cold knot tighten in her stomach. She knew he was right. This was not a town at rest. It was a town holding its breath. Mayor Turner knew they had gone to Santa Fe. He would not simply wait for them to return and present their evidence to a judge he likely owned. He would meet them here, on his own terms, in this street that had already judged and condemned her. They rode forward slowly, their horses' hooves kicking up small puffs of red dust that hung in the still air. The windows of the buildings were like vacant eyes, watching them. The silence was a physical pressure, a weight on their shoulders. As they reached the edge of the main street, the trap was sprung. The first shot came from the roof of the general store, a sharp crack that sent a splinter of wood flying from the saddle horn of Eleanor's horse. Her mount reared in terror, and she fought to control it, her heart hammering against her ribs. More shots followed, a volley of lead from the shadowed alleyway beside the saloon and the second-story window of the mayor's office. It was an ambush, a cowardly attack designed to kill them before they could speak a single word of truth. Elias reacted instantly. He yelled for her to get down and spurred his horse toward the flimsy cover of a water trough, firing his own pistol toward the source of the gunshots. The air exploded into a chaotic symphony of violence. Gunsmoke, thick and acrid, filled the street, obscuring everything in a gray, hazy fog. The sound of gunfire was a continuous, deafening roar, punctuated by the high-pitched whine of ricocheting bullets and the panicked whinnying of their horses. Dust and grit filled Eleanor's mouth and stung her eyes. It was a maelstrom of noise, smoke, and terror. She slid from her horse, pressing her body against the rough wood of the trough, the Colt heavy and unfamiliar in her hand. Through a momentary gap in the swirling smoke, she saw one of the ambushers, a man she recognized as one of Turner's cronies, break from cover and run toward Elias's flank. There was no time to think, no time for fear. She raised the pistol, just as Elias had taught her. Lining up the sights on the running man, she fired. The kick of the gun was a brutal shock to her arm, but her aim was true. The man cried out and fell, clutching his leg. His attack thwarted. The fight raged on, a desperate battle for survival in the middle of the street. Elias, despite his wounded shoulder, fought with a cold, deadly efficiency. He moved from cover to cover, his shots measured and precise, but there were too many of them. A bullet grazed his cheek, leaving a bloody furrow. Another tore through the sleeve of his good arm. He was weakening, losing blood, and they both knew it. Then, the unthinkable happened. A bullet caught him in the side, a heavy impact that threw him back against the wall of the blacksmith's shop. He slumped to the ground, his face pale, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. He tried to raise his pistol, but his strength failed him. He looked at Eleanor, his eyes filled with a desperate urgency, and gasped her name. Seeing him fall, something inside Eleanor broke free of the last vestiges of fear. A white-hot rage, pure and clean as a flame, consumed her. These men, this town, this corrupt mayor had taken everything from her. They would not take him. She rose from behind the trough, her face a mask of cold fury. She fired the Colt, not wildly, but with a deliberate, steady aim that made the remaining gunmen pause. They had expected a frightened woman, not a vengeful angel armed with a pistol and a righteous cause. The brief lull in the fighting was broken by a new sound. The door to the mayor's office was thrown open, and Augustus Turner himself appeared, his face contorted in a mask of rage and panic. His plan was failing. He was exposed, and in his desperation, he committed his final, monstrous act. He grabbed the person nearest to him, a woman who had been cowering inside his office, and dragged her out into the street, holding her in front of him as a human shield. It was his wife, May. May Turner screamed, her eyes wide with terror and a dawning, soul-shattering comprehension. She looked from her husband's cruel, desperate face to the pistol he held pressed against her temple. In that moment, she saw him for what he truly was, a monster who would sacrifice anyone, even her, to save himself. The fine dresses, the social standing, the comfortable life. It had all been built on a foundation of lies and cruelty, and now it was collapsing, burying her in the ruins. The remaining gunmen, seeing their employer's cowardice, lost their nerve, one by one. They melted back into the alleyways, leaving Turner alone in the street with his hostage. He began to back away, dragging May with him, his eyes darting between Eleanor and the wounded, struggling form of the sheriff. He shouted that if anyone tried to stop him, he would kill her. Eleanor stood alone in the center of the dusty, blood-stained street, the smoking Colt in her hand. She looked at May, at the friend who had betrayed her, the woman who was now a captive of the very man she had protected. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a deep, profound sorrow. This was the end of it all, the final, ugly act in a tragedy of greed and lies. Turner was a dozen yards away. He was fumbling, trying to mount a horse while still holding on to May. In that moment of distraction, May twisted violently, biting his hand. He roared in pain and surprise, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was the only chance Eleanor would get. She raised the pistol, her arm steady, her gaze unwavering. She saw not the man who had burned down her life, not the man who had tried to have her killed. She saw only the threat to another human being. She fired. The shot was a single, clean crack in the sudden silence. Augustus Turner stiffened, a look of stunned surprise on his face. He released May and took a stumbling step backward, his hand going to the dark hole that had appeared in the center of his chest. He fell to his knees, and then pitched forward into the dust, his reign of terror over. For a long moment, no one moved. The thick gray gun smoke began to dissipate, and as if on cue, the sky, which had been a harsh, unforgiving blue, began to weep. A light rain started to fall, each drop landing with a soft hiss in the warm dust. The rain fell on the living and the dead, on the righteous and the wicked. It was a gentle, cleansing rain, washing the blood from the street and the smoke from the air. Justice and absolution, falling from the heavens. May Turner, released from her captor, sank to her knees in the muddy street. Her fine dress was ruined, her face a mess of tears and dirt. She looked across the space at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a shame so profound it was a physical agony. She crawled forward, sobbing, and collapsed at Eleanor's feet, her words choked and broken, repeating her name, begging for a forgiveness she did not deserve. Eleanor did not offer forgiveness. She did not have any left to give. She simply looked down at the ruined woman at her feet, and then turned her gaze to where Elias lay. She ran to him, falling to her knees beside him in the mud and the rain. He was conscious, barely. His breath was shallow, his face ashen. He reached up with his one good hand and took hers. His blood mingled with the clean rainwater on her skin. He looked into her eyes, and a faint smile touched his lips. He told her she was free now. He told her not to ever let the town tell her otherwise. The strength seemed to go out of both of them at once. He sagged in her arms, his consciousness finally succumbing to the pain and loss of blood. She, in turn, leaned her head against his chest, the last of her rage and strength spent. They fell together in a heap, two wounded souls clinging to each other in the soft, forgiving rain, the earth itself seeming to offer a final, silent pardon. The aftermath of the gunfight was a quiet, muddy affair. The rain had washed the blood from the street, leaving dark, clean patches on the red earth. Augustus Turner's body was taken away without ceremony, wrapped in a canvas tarp and loaded onto the back of a buckboard. The town doctor, his hands surprisingly steady now that the shooting was over, worked for hours over Elias Boone in the small room behind the sheriff's office. He probed for the bullet, stitched the wound, and poured raw, burning whiskey into it to cleanse it. He gave Elias a 50-50 chance of seeing the next sunrise. May Turner's confession was not a single, clean act, but a long, ragged unraveling. The circuit judge, summoned from the next county, listened with a grim expression as she sat in the sheriff's office. A drab wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her fine silk dress ruined and discarded, stripped of her husband and her social standing. All that was left was a terrified, broken woman. She told them everything. She spoke of her husband's gambling debts, of his scheme to steal the church funds, of the false bottom in the lockbox. She confessed to her role in the accusation against Eleanor, her words tumbling out in a torrent of self-loathing and shame. She detailed the hiring of the gunman at the fair and the plan to have Elias and Eleanor killed before they could reach town with the evidence from Santa Fe. It was a full and complete accounting of a life built on a foundation of lies. Her testimony, combined with the land deed, legally and officially exonerated Eleanor of all charges. But a judge's decree could not change the hearts of the people. The town of Dry Creek fell into a profound and unsettling silence. When Eleanor walked to the general store for supplies or to the well for water, the whispers and glares were gone. In their place was something worse, a complete and total avoidance of her existence. People would cross the street to avoid passing her on the boardwalk. Conversations would cease when she entered a room. Eyes would drop to the ground. They did not hate her anymore. They were ashamed. But their shame was a private, selfish thing. It did not translate into apology or reconciliation. To apologize to Eleanor would be to admit their own gullibility, their own cruelty, their own eagerness to believe the worst. And so, they chose silence. They wrapped it around themselves like a shroud, hoping that if they did not speak of the injustice, it would eventually fade from memory. Just another unpleasantness to be buried by the ever-present dust. The town would not apologize, because to do so would be to apologize to itself. Elias's room became Eleanor's entire world. The fever returned, and for days he drifted in and out of consciousness, his body waging a silent, desperate war against the infection. She was his general in that war. She sat by his bedside day and night, changing his bandages, cooling his brow, and forcing spoonfuls of water and broth between his cracked lips. The intimacy of the sick room was absolute. She saw him at his most vulnerable, his strength stripped away, his life a fragile flame flickering in her hands. She learned the rhythms of his breathing, the sound of his pained sighs in his sleep, in this small, quiet space. Their bond deepened beyond what had been forged in the desert and in the gunfight. It was a bond of shared survival, of a quiet, stubborn refusal to let the world break them. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to heal. The fever broke, and the light of consciousness returned to his eyes for good. The first time he was able to sit up on his own, leaning against a pile of pillows, They shared a meal of watery stew in a comfortable silence that felt more profound than any declaration of love. As his strength returned, so did his awareness of the town's silent judgment. He saw the way Eleanor held herself when she returned from an errand, the subtle tightening of her shoulders, the weary look in her eyes. He knew that their victory had been a hollow one. They had won the battle, but the town itself was lost to them. One afternoon, the acting mayor, a portly hardware merchant named Abernathy, came to the office. He cleared his throat nervously and explained that the town council was holding a meeting. They wished for Eleanor to attend. It was time, he said, for the town to put this unfortunate business behind them and move forward. The meeting was held in the saloon, the only building large enough to hold the council and the curious townspeople who had gathered to watch. Eleanor walked in, her head held high. Elias, leaning heavily on a carved stick for support, walked beside her, his presence a silent, unwavering statement of his allegiance. Abernathy and the other councilmen sat at a table at the front of the room. They spoke in platitudes, in vague, meaningless phrases about healing and community. They proposed a new collection for the church roof. They spoke of appointing a new sheriff until Elias was fully recovered. They spoke of everything except the truth. They were attempting to paper over a gaping wound with official pronouncements, to clean the town's reputation by simply ignoring the stain upon it. Finally, Abernathy turned to Eleanor, a patronizing smile on his face. He said that on behalf of the town. They were all very sorry for her ordeal and were glad the matter was now settled. He hoped she could find it in her heart to help them all move on. Eleanor looked at the faces of the councilmen, and beyond them, at the faces of the townspeople. She saw no remorse, no genuine contrition. She saw only a desperate desire to forget, to return to the comfortable ignorance of their former lives. She stepped forward, her voice clear and steady in the suddenly silent room. "Your silence is your confession." The words were not an accusation. They were a simple statement of fact. She let the truth of them settle in the stuffy, stale air of the saloon. "You turned your backs on me when I was accused, and you are silent now that I am exonerated. You condemned me without evidence, and you forgive yourselves without apology. Your silence is the final verdict, not on my guilt, but on your own." A deep, uncomfortable quiet followed her words. Men shuffled their feet and stared at the floorboards. Women fiddled with their shawls. And then, from the back of the room, a new sound. It was the slow, deliberate clapping of a single pair of hands. Old Henry, the jailer, a man who had seen more of human nature than anyone in the room, was standing, his wrinkled face set in a look of profound respect. He was applauding her. A moment later, another person joined in, a dirt-poor farmer from the edge of town who had no standing to lose. Then another, and another. It was not a thunderous ovation, but it was something far more powerful. It was the cracking of the ice, a small but undeniable acknowledgement of the truth she had spoken. Her name was cleared, her innocence proven, but she knew she could never get back what had been taken from her. Her past in Dry Creek was a ghost, a story that would always be told in whispers. The next day, she walked to the edge of town, to the charred and skeletal ruins of the Silver Spur Saloon. She picked her way through the debris until she found the rotten remains of a trunk. Inside, miraculously preserved from the worst of the fire and the weather, was the dress she used to wear when she sang. It was a simple thing of dark blue velvet, now faded and stained, but it was the last remnant of the woman she had been. She took it back to the sheriff's office and hung it on a nail on the back of the door. It was not a trophy. It was a memorial. It was a final, silent farewell to a life that no longer existed. A public acknowledgement that the girl who had sung sad songs for lonely men was gone forever. Elias found her standing there, looking at the dress. He had been watching her from his chair, his heart aching for the weight of the past she carried. He stood, his reliance on the walking stick a little less pronounced than the day before. and came to stand beside her. He looked from the dress to her face. He told her that they could build something new, somewhere the dust does not judge. His words were not a question, but a statement of a shared future. She turned from the dress, from the ghosts of her past, and looked at him. She saw in his steady gaze not an escape, but a destination, a new beginning, forged in fire and blood, and a love that had proven stronger than both. She nodded, a single, silent tear tracing a clean path through the dust on her cheek. Their decision was made. They would leave Dry Creek to its silence and its ghosts and ride out in search of a place where they could finally be free. They did not leave Dry Creek at dawn in a blaze of defiant glory. They left in the quiet, anonymous light of midday, their departure as unremarkable as that of any other traveler passing through. Elias left his badge on the desk in the office, a small piece of tin that had come to represent both his honor and his cage. Eleanor left the faded blue velvet dress hanging on the back of the door, a ghost she was finally ready to release. They mounted their horses, turned them west toward the vast, sun-bleached expanse of the horizon, and did not look back. To look back would be to give the town and its silence a power they no longer possessed. The journey west was a slow, deliberate shedding of the past. With each mile that passed, the red dust of Dry Creek was replaced by the paler sand of the high desert, and then the richer, darker soil of lands blessed with more water. The landscape unspooled before them, a panorama of breathtaking, brutal beauty. They rode through canyons carved by ancient rivers, their walls painted with stripes of ochre and vermilion. They crossed wide, grassy plains where herds of antelope flowed like water over the gentle swells of the earth. At night, they made camp under a blanket of stars so thick and bright it seemed to hum with a silent, cosmic energy. The world felt new, unwritten, a blank page on which they could scribe their own story. 1 week into their journey, they came upon a small, nascent settlement huddled in the crook of a shallow, winding river. It was not a town, but a collection of half-built sod houses and canvas tents, a place of raw beginnings. The people there were gaunt and sunburnt, their clothes patched and their hands calloused, but their eyes held a fierce, determined light. They were miners and their families, drawn west by the rumor of a silver strike in the nearby hills. They were people who had nothing, and therefore had nothing to lose. Eleanor and Elias stayed for a few days, sharing their supplies and the strength of their backs, while Elias helped the men shore up a support beam in the makeshift mine shaft. Eleanor found herself drawn to the children. They were a wild, dusty tribe, their face smudged with dirt, their laughter the only currency of real value in this hard-scrabble place. She saw the weariness in their mother's eyes and the deep, etched lines of worry on their father's brows. One afternoon, as the children were playing a listless game in the dirt, she sat down on an overturned bucket and began to sing. It was a simple song, a ballad she remembered from the orphanage, a tune of lost love and a promised land. Her voice, which she had thought was only a vessel for the sad songs of lonely men, felt different here. It was clear and strong, and it carried on the dry air a thread of pure, simple beauty. The children stopped their play and gathered around her, their eyes wide with a wonder she had not seen since she had left them. She taught them the words, and soon their small, reedy voices joined hers, a ragged but heartfelt chorus rising up to meet the vast, indifferent sky. For the first time in years, her voice was not a performance or a memory, but a gift, freely given and joyfully received. It was a kind of healing she had not known she needed. They left the small settlement with their supplies diminished, but their spirits renewed. They rode on, and a few weeks later, they found their place. It was a town called Promise, a name that was more of a prayer than a description. It was another mining camp, larger and more established than the first one they had encountered, but still a place defined by hard work and the shared gamble of an uncertain future. The air was filled with the rhythmic clang of blacksmiths' hammers and the distant rumble of blasting in the hills. The people were a rough, unvarnished lot, a mixture of a dozen different nationalities, all drawn by the lure of silver. It was a town with no memory, a place where a person's past was of no consequence next to the strength of their hands and the honesty of their word. Elias did not seek to be the town's sheriff. Instead, he rented a small, one-room office and hung a simple, hand-painted sign outside E. Boone, legal counsel and notary public. He offered his knowledge of the law not to punish, but to protect. He drew up mining claims for prospectors who could not read, ensuring they would not be swindled by predatory speculators. He mediated disputes between neighbors over water rights. His calm, steady presence a balm on frayed tempers. He was still a lawman. But his authority now came not from a badge, but from the trust and respect he earned. One honest transaction at a time. It was a law built on a foundation of humanity, not just statutes. Eleanor, in turn, opened a small sewing shop. It was not the fine tailoring establishment she had known in Dry Creek, with its bolts of silk and its wealthy patrons. Her customers were the wives of miners, women whose lives were a constant battle against dust and poverty. She mended torn work shirts and patched the knees of children's trousers, but she also brought small, unexpected touches of beauty into their hard lives. She would add a bit of colorful embroidered trim to the collar of a little girl's dress, or sew a patch of soft flannel inside a rough wool coat. She became known for one small, signature service. For a few pennies, she would embroider a woman's name or a simple flower onto a plain cotton handkerchief. It was a small, seemingly frivolous thing, but the women treasured them. In a life of unending labor, it was a reminder that they were not just workers, but women who were loved, whose identities were worth preserving in a single, beautiful stitch. They lived in a small cabin on the edge of town, with a view of the rugged, purple mountains to the west. Their life was simple, spare, and filled with a quiet, profound contentment they had never known. One evening, as they sat on their porch, watching the last of the sun's light paint the clouds in fiery streaks of orange and gold, Elias turned to her. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, simple ring, a plain band of hammered silver. He held it out to her in the palm of his calloused hand. "It is not much," he said, his voice low and earnest, "but it is steady, like me." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of a joy so pure it felt like a prayer. She did not need grand pronouncements or flowery poetry. His simple words were the truest expression of the man he was, and the love he offered. She took the ring, and it was cool and solid against her skin. They were married the next day. They walked down to the small, clear stream that ran behind their cabin, the water chuckling and whispering over smooth stones. There was no preacher, no congregation, no town to bear witness. Their vows were made to each other, under the watchful eyes of the mountains and the vast, open sky. He slid the silver ring onto her finger, and she placed her hand on his cheek, the faint stubble of his beard a familiar, comforting texture. "You saved me," she whispered, the words catching in her throat. He covered her hand with his own, his thumb gently stroking her skin. He shook his head slowly, his gaze deep and unwavering. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "You made me worth saving." They stood there as the sun began to dip below the mountain peaks, setting the sky ablaze. The colors were impossibly rich, a riot of deep, bloody red and brilliant, molten gold. It was the color of the desert dust and the spilled blood of their past. But here, in this new place, it was transformed, redeemed into a thing of breathtaking, heartbreaking beauty. As the last sliver of the sun disappeared, a faint, high-pitched sound reached them. They looked up and saw it, a long, wavering V of migratory birds, flying south for the winter. They were etched against the darkening sky, a perfect, living symbol of what they had found together. They were a testament to freedom, to the instinct for survival, to the forgiveness of a long journey, and to the promise of a new season, rebirth, soaring on silent wings. They turned and walked back toward their small cabin, their arms around each other. The light faded from the sky, and the first stars began to appear. Their figures grew smaller as they walked, eventually blending into the gathering shadows. Soon, there was nothing left but the sound of the wind sighing through the pines, the soft, eternal light of the stars, and the faint, fading echo of their footsteps on the path to tomorrow. Time, in the high desert, is a patient sculptor. It works not in days or years, but in the slow, relentless abrasion of wind and sun. Decades after Elias Boone and Eleanor Vance rode west, the town of Dry Creek had all but surrendered to this patient erosion. The silver strike that had given it life had played out, and the people had drifted away like tumbleweeds, leaving behind a ghost of a town to be scoured and reclaimed by the dust. The general store was a hollow, sightless shell, its windows boarded up. The saloon sagged on its foundations, its bat-wing doors long since torn away by the wind. The silence that had once been a weapon of shame was now simply the natural state of things, the profound, empty quiet of a place that had lost its story. But the desert remembers every footstep. Some towns forget easy, but the land holds on. And so, the story of the woman and the sheriff did not die with the town. It became a piece of the landscape itself, a tale told by the wind as it whispered through the skeletal remains of the buildings. One evening, as a sliver of moon rose in the indigo sky, a traveler sat among the ruins of the old saloon. He was a man of indeterminate age, his face a leathery map of roads traveled and stories heard. He was a balladeer, a keeper of the forgotten songs, and he cradled a guitar whose wood was as worn and polished as a river stone. He had heard the story in a dozen different towns, each telling a little different, the facts blurred by time, but the heart of it always the same. He began to play, his fingers coaxing a sad, simple melody from the strings, and he sang, his voice a low, gravelly hum that seemed to be the voice of the dust itself. He sang of betrayal, of a friendship poisoned by greed and fear. He sang of a town's swift and terrible judgment, of the loneliness of a woman who was condemned not for what she had done, but for who she was. He sang of the quiet, unshakable faith of a lawman who chose a single human soul over the clamor of the mob. He sang of the clash of loyalties, of the painful, bloody birth of justice in a dusty street. But most of all, he sang of love, a love that was not a sweet, gentle thing, but a fierce, stubborn courage that had dared to grow in the most barren of soils. He sang of the strength of a woman who had been a victim, then a survivor, then a warrior, a woman who had refused to be defined by the stories others told about her. His song traveled from the ruins of Dry Creek and soared on the night air, carrying the story westward, to the town called Promise. There, the legend was not a ghost, but a living thing. The people of Promise knew the story not as a cautionary tale, but as their own foundation myth. In the 20 years since Elias and Eleanor had arrived, the town had grown, the mines had prospered, and the rough camp had become a respectable settlement with a church, a school, and a neat row of houses with picket fences. Eleanor's sewing shop was on the main street, a cheerful place with a bright blue door and window boxes overflowing with geraniums. Inside, it was a hub of the community, a place where women gathered not just for thread and fabric, but for conversation and companionship. On the wall behind the counter, next to a framed photograph of a smiling, gray-haired Eleanor and a dignified, silver-haired Elias, hung a curious object. It was an old sheriff's badge, the tin star of Dry Creek. It was rusted and pitted, the metal dulled by time and exposure to the elements. But in the very center of the star, a single spot had been polished over the years by some unknown, loving hand, and it caught the light, a tiny, brilliant spark in the heart of the tarnished metal. It was a reminder not of a failed town, but of a promise kept, of an honor that had been preserved not by clinging to a title, but by choosing to stand for what was right. Elias Boone had served as the town's first elected judge, a position he held for 15 years until his peaceful death in his own bed, his hand held firmly in Eleanor's. His legacy was not in the jail he never had to build, but in the fair contracts and settled disputes that had allowed the town to grow on a foundation of trust. Eleanor Vance Boone outlived him by 5 years. A beloved matriarch of the town she had helped to build, her voice, once silenced by tragedy, had become a source of joy, and the songs she had taught the first dusty children of the mining camp were now passed down to their own children, a living thread in the fabric of the town's history. Back in the ruins of Dry Creek, the balladeer's song was coming to an end. The moon was higher now, casting long, skeletal shadows across the empty street. He sang the final verses, his voice dropping to a near whisper, as if sharing a sacred secret with the ghosts of the past. He sang of a love that had not just saved 2 people, but had become a quiet lesson, a reminder to all who heard it that trust is the rarest and most precious currency in the hearts of men. It is the difficult, holy ground where true love can finally take root. He strummed the final, fading chord, and his voice delivered the last lines, the very heart of the legend. The words that had been polished by 1,000 retellings until they shone with a simple, unadorned truth. Betrayed by a friend, forgotten by the town, but she found her forever, right there, in the sheriff's steady gaze. He sat for a long moment in the ensuing silence, the last notes of his song absorbed by the vast, listening desert, and then, in the east, the first, faint hint of a new day began to touch the horizon. A pale, ethereal light crept over the land, illuminating the crumbling adobe walls and the empty, staring windows of Dry Creek. It was a gentle, forgiving light, a light that did not judge or condemn. It simply was. It was a quiet, impartial absolution, offered not by man, but by the turning of the world itself. The dawn broke over the ghost town, a silent, final closing of a chapter, the soft, peaceful exhalation of the West as one age gave way to the next. Thank you for listening to our story. Please let us know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect, and be sure to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more people.